Hiya, I'm going to talk to you today about reverb units. I'm going to explain the controls, how they work, their history, and I'm going to tell you everything there is to know about reverb units. So what does the term reverb mean? Reverberation is actually when the sound waves reflect off the surfaces around you and the sound returns to your ear, and that creates reverb. For instance, say you're standing in a room talking, the sound waves come out of your mouth, they bounce off the closest wall, they also bounce off the walls furthest away from you, and the sound waves return to your ear at different times. And this is what actually creates the reverb effect. It's the sound waves reflecting off the surfaces around you. Every sound in nature has reverb. From a tiled bathroom or toilet right up to a church, you can clearly hear the different sounds of the different reverbs yourself. Now, it's a very important effect. I'd even say that things actually sound unnatural without reverb, because every sound we hear in nature, even if you're outdoors, you're getting sound reflecting off the surfaces around you. And when there's no reverb on anything, things can sound a little unnatural. Equipment such as speakers and microphones, etc., are tested in an environment which has absolutely no reverb, because otherwise it would colour the test results. This room is called an anechoic chamber. And inside an anechoic chamber, there's absolutely zero reflection. There's no reverb whatsoever. Like, I've been inside one before, and it's actually a really weird sensation. It almost hurt. It feels uncomfortable. It's so quiet. Very, very strange. So I've explained to you what reverb is. Let's go through the different types. The first type of reverb that was invented is a spring reverb. Now, spring reverbs are very popular and still are on guitar amps. Like a classic spring reverb is like Fender, and they still use spring reverbs to this day. You can see from the diagram, spring reverb, they put the signal through a metal spring, and the output from the metal spring is mixed with the dry signal, and that achieves the reverb effect. The next type of reverb effect is called a plate reverb. A plate is actually what it says it is. It's a large metal plate, which actually looks like a table tennis table when it's packed up. The sound again is fed through the metal plate, and the sound is picked up from pickups, and it is mixed back in with the original signal. Like a classic plate company were EMT, who built plates. Obviously, the thing about plates were they were very impractical because of the sheer size and the cost. They're like 4 foot by 8 foot. They're huge. But I must say, plates are my favourite sounding reverb. They sound so lush. And of course, there's plate settings on modern reverbs, but original plates do sound great. So spring verbs and plate reverbs come into the category of analogue reverbs. And with the development of electronics, you could get analogue reverbs made from components, and they were quite common, but they weren't very good. Digital verbs were available from the late 70s, but they were so much money, you're talking thousands of pounds. When it comes to digital reverbs, the king of all verbs is a company called Lexicon. And they discovered and invented their own reverb algorithms that made their reverbs sound beautiful. And every professional studio, bar none, you will find Lexicon reverbs in, such as the classic 480 or the 224. The 480 was about £10,000 and the 224 was about £5,000. But the good thing about them was they came with a remote controller that would actually sit on the mixing desk. So apart from being very practical, they just sounded superb. And they're probably still used today. They also made a single unit reverb called the PCM 70. They're fantastic reverbs. And they just sound really natural and really amazing. But in the 80s came the first affordable small digital reverb unit made by Alesis called the Microverb 1. In fact, I actually bought one for my guitar rig because they sounded so great back in the day, and they were quite revolutionary. Nowadays, with the coming of computers, you've got plug-in reverbs, things like the Ether, things like the Waves IR1, which stands for Impulse Response Reverb. The IR1 can actually sample or model a room or hall, so you can actually use them as a preset effect. It actually creates a replica of the room sound. And of course, it'll also do synthetic reverbs as well. So that just about covers all the types of verb, the springs, the plates, analogues and digitals, and your digital plugins. Okay, I'm going to talk about common controls on reverb units. To start with, there's the actual type of reverb that you're going to use, like small rooms, medium rooms, large rooms, halls, concert rooms, plates. They come in many shapes and sizes, and that's the actual type of reverb that you're going to select. Then there's various parameters that allow you to change the reverb from there. The first main parameter is the decay time, which is measured in seconds. This applies to how long the reverb will continue for. Like a room might only be a second decay, whereas a hall or a church might be 5 or 6 seconds in length. But the decay control can be adjusted regardless of how long it is on the preset. Make it longer or shorter if you like. There's also a control for size. When it comes to lexicons, they actually measure the size in meters. So you can have a room that's 16 meters square, 32 meters, 40 meters square. Whereas on some reverbs, it's just done by a number, 0 being the smallest room, 100 being the largest. So apart from selecting the type of reverb, say you pick a small room, you determine the size of the room. So size is a really important control. Probably the most important two reverb controls are decay and size. Now the next parameter is the pre-delay, which is measured in milliseconds, and it's the time, the actual delay before the reverb actually kicks in, and it gives the impression of the reverb being really large. So the next is the density control. The density varies the smoothness of the reverb. So increasing the density, it makes it smoother. When you decrease the density, it gets a bit grainier. Next is the diffusion control, and this sends more early reflection to the tail of the reverb. The more you add, the more it sends to the tail. Then there's the early reflection control. This adds a perception of distance, and it's actually the time that it takes for the first reflection to get back to your ear off the surface of the room or hall selected. And equally, there's an early reflection gain, and this determines the amount of reflection. You can have more or less, depending if the gain's on cut or boost. Next is the EQ section, which comes in all shapes and sizes. Low cut, low pass, high boost, high cut, or damp, as it's sometimes called. You can either add or roll off the frequencies on the treble or the bass. And usually, reverbs sound better rolling off about 4K and above. Especially with cheap reverbs, the biggest difference between a cheap reverb and an expensive reverb, apart from the sheer quality and naturalness, is the horrible mushy top end that you get on cheap reverb units. But as I say, the tip is just to roll off 4K and above. Now, the term tail refers to everything in the reverb after the early reflections. So that is actually referring to the main bulk of the reverb sound. That's tail. Of course, there are other more obscure controls found on reverb units, but these are the main ones found on most reverb processors. So that covers the controls for you, really. So let's take a look at using reverb on different instruments. On the coming examples, I've got the reverb louder than you usually have it in the mix, just so you can hear it. I'm going to demonstrate some rhythm guitar. I've got the Waves IR1 reverb unit to demonstrate these guitars to you. To begin with, I've got the verb off, so there isn't any reverb on. It's just a dry rhythm guitar. Now, if I turn it on, that's the effects on. Now, at the moment, I've got 0.6. Decay time, reverb time, 0.6. Now if I take it up to 1.2, again it still sounds nice. But there's a point with rhythm guitars anyway, and reverbs, once you get up to about 2 seconds, look, what we on, 2.2. it starts to wash out a bit, you see. Let's take it back down. 27. And off again with the reverb. That's reverb off. Reverb back on. When it comes to adding the effect onto guitars, small reverbs work really well on rock and rhythm style guitars. Large reverbs don't work so well, as you've seen, unless the song has space and there's sustained chords, in which case you can use a larger reverb. So not only does a particular reverb work on a particular sound, it can even depend on what the instrument is playing, what type of reverb effect is actually chosen. I'm going to demonstrate to you on the slide guitar what a plate reverb sounds like. So I've got a DSP reverb here. It's got various plates. Look, ballad plate. Let's go for a gold plate. So we'll call that up. Let's start with the reverb off. Now I've got a gold plate called up. So let's put the reverb on. That's 2.7 seconds decay time. And that gives that really dreamy guitar sound. So large reverbs do have their place. Particularly on solo guitars, not so much on rhythm guitars. You have to decide whether you like the sound of it. If it fits well in the song, go with it. Large reverb can work really well on sort of a ballad type vocal. I'm using the internal Ableton reverb, and you can see I've got about 3.6 seconds decay. You know, a classic ballad, and you can get away with a nice large reverb and it works. Ballad songs such as anything I do it for you. And songs such as U2's With or Without You, with or without you, with or without you. But generally speaking, with vocals, you're talking more sort of ballad types. When there's slower lyrics, then again, you've got the space for the reverb to hang and do its thing. There's another example of using a large reverb on the vocals. In my experience, I've had vocalists say that I don't want any reverb on the vocals, but sometimes just using something really small and subtle can work. So I'll show you what I mean. I've got a reverb open inside Ableton with only 0.6 of a second decay time. I play the vocal with the reverb off. Too much, don't think that I can take it. Can't stop, but I'm gonna make it. And now I'll play with it on. Too much, don't think that I can take it. Can't stop, but I'm gonna make it. And you can hear that it just sort of sounds nice. It's subtle without being washy, like a ballad vocal would be. So it's a good way of getting a bit of reverb on a vocal. Too much, don't think that I can take it. Can't stop, but I'm gonna make it. There's actually a couple of special effect reverbs. The first is called a reverse reverb. And what this does, it plays the reverb signal backwards. So it sounds sort of like a tape going backwards, because the original dry signal goes forward, but it turns the reverb effect backwards, and it gives an effect of sounding backwards. But obviously, if you want to go for that effect fully, you're better off reversing the signal itself rather than just the reverb. Another special effects type of reverb is called gated reverb. What this does, this takes a larger reverb, let's say 3 seconds decay, and what it does, it applies a noise gate, so it cuts off the signal after, say, half a second. So you get a huge reverb, but without it carrying on for 3 seconds and muddying the mix. Like, it was made popular on snare drums in the 80s and 90s, people like Phil Collins, and particularly on rock snares as well. Gated verb was used a hell of a lot. I'm going to do some drum sounds now to demonstrate a gated reverb. I've got the Waves R-verb, the Renaissance reverb up. And I'm going to show you a gated reverb on the snare. So that's reverb off. Now the gate on, it gives that classic rock snare. You can hear the 3 second decays being cut off after about half a second. The noise gate cuts it short. So that's what a gated reverb does. I'll turn that gate off. I'll show you it again on another different reverb, which is made by Mook DSP, but it gives the same type of effect. That big rock snare. So that's gated reverb for you. But it gives that classic rock snare sound. Very useful indeed. Another example of using reverbs on snare drums is in reggae, particularly in dub music. What they do, they play with the reverb send on the snare channel. So they'll have it dry without any reverb or just the normal small verb on it. And every now and again they'll go and wind the reverb up and you get a with a cavernous reverb, as you can hear now on my reggae track that I did. Hear the big reverbs going off and it sounds good. It's a very effective use of using large reverbs on snares. When it comes to production, reverb can help place the instrument or vocal in the stereo field, also called the stereo sound stage, and it can help it place it to the left, to the right of the mix, to the front of the mix, to the rear of the mix, and basically it creates layers between the various sounds. Now I've got a diagram here that I want to show you that explains this quite well. On the diagram here, I've got a representation of the stereo sound stage. So you've got the front of the stereo sound stage, left and right, and you've got the back of the mix. So at the front, you've got the kick drum, the bass guitar, the keyboards and rhythm guitar. You've got the toms spread either side, the snare drum and the hat, and the main vocal are all fairly at the front of the mix. And then you've got the percussion cymbals spread right across the stereo field in the sort of centre of the mix. Behind that is the lead guitar, and then the background vocals, and then the horn section, and finally right at the back of the sound stage is the strings. I'm not saying copy the diagram, but it just shows you how you can use reverbs to layer up the sounds, helping to place instruments in the stereo sound stage, creating width in a mix. As usual, when it comes to selecting and using reverb effects, it's the old adage applies, use your ears. If you love the sound of it and it works well in the song, then use it. It really is just down to your own opinion. And that's what makes music so unique and so original. Every song or album sounds different. From the equipment used, down to the reverbs chosen, to how the guitar's strummed. All these factors colour the sound and make it unique and original. Well, that just about covers everything to do with reverbs. I've covered the types of reverbs, the controls, and I've explained their uses. I've also made videos about digital delays and echoes, compressors, phasers, flanges and choruses, and everything you wanted to know about them. So do have a look at these videos because they're really informative. And you can also check out some of my songs by watching my videos, such as Walking the River, Fisherman's Blues, Sexy Girls Getting Down to Slide Guitar, which is actually a track called Turning Tide. So do take a look, spread the word and tell your mates. Give me a thumbs up if you like the videos, or even subscribe to my channel. So I hope you've enjoyed the videos, and take care, and I'll see you soon.